Indie games have always held a special place in my heart. From the first time I played Bastion in 2011 to discovering Hyperlight Drifter in 2016, these games made me believe that video games truly are high art. Fast forward to 2025 and Hyperlight Breaker releases as a 3D roguelite prequel in early access. Considering other coverage of this game, is it as bad as people say it is? Well, the answer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. Let's get into it. In Hyperlight Breaker, you play as a breaker venturing into the overgrowth to defeat the crowns and overthrow the Abyss King. While not cited as an influence, think of it as Souls meets Risk of Rain 2 but with a glider, hoverboard, and wall climbing abilities that encourage verticality and traversal. Because this game is an extraction and a roguelite, you have the potential to lose everything upon death. The basic gameplay loop is pretty simple. Collect resources, defeat the crowns, and eventually take on the Abyss King, who by the way isn't in the game yet at this point in early access. An early game pro tip is to extract early and often. Until you've got decent gear, fighting nearly any enemy is like trying to take down a linebacker with a pool noodle. While I eventually found my rhythm, this game is significantly unfriendly to new or beginner players. Of course, if you spend enough time, you can eventually beat all the crowns and experience the full content of early access like I did. However, within the first 30 minutes, I was getting straight murked. It was likely because I hadn't understood how the dash worked yet. Despite that, for the most part, the gameplay is pretty damn fun. Combat, to me, is where Hyperlight Breaker shines, most of the time. Your primary weapon is a blade and you have a multi-hit combo, a charged attack, a flash step, aka a dash attack, and a weapon ability. Another pro tip is to dash cancel practically all the time. Once I learned that, I had a slightly easier time. Each weapon type feels distinct, from dual swords to hammers, while ranged weapons like railguns and revolvers add some variety. My personal favorites are the dual swords and revolvers, because who doesn't want to feel like a samurai and a cowboy did the fusion dance? That said, the combat isn't without its flaws. The parry mechanic is clunky, with the window so tight it makes Dark Souls 2 feel forgiving. I was able to get it down for the boss fights, which at the same time feels like a requirement to avoid getting squashed within the first few minutes. But weirdly enough, parrying smaller, faster enemies and ranged projectiles feels nearly impossible. Successful parries grant a sliver of health recovery a la Bloodborne's rally mechanic, but the lack of clear visual or audio feedback makes it hard to tell if you've pulled it off. And don't get me started on the flopping animation. It's like your character suddenly forgets how to stand up, leaving you vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The durability system adds another layer of punishment. Each death costs you a res, 1 of 4 lives per cycle, and reduces your gear's durability. Higher rarity items have more durability, but losing a res early on can feel pretty brutal. One workaround is to use an unequipped second breaker to farm gear without risking your primary loadout. Then there's the danger meter, which works like Risk of Rain 2's threat level, but is a bit more frustrating to deal with. It increases over time, and as you engage with the overgrowth, it spawns more formidable enemies and mini-bosses like the Adept or the Engineer, and it goes full after defeating a crown. Side note, the Engineer sucks. F that guy, especially for spawning into my extraction zone and littering his stupid little mines everywhere. But I digress. Other mechanics like radioactive meteors can feel frustrating as well. They drain your health if you linger too long and sometimes block access to loot, which feels like a cheap way to waste your time. A possibly better implementation might reward players who brave the radiation with higher rarity loot or give bonuses to bright blood amounts. Now let's talk about the crowns, the bosses of Hyperlight Breaker. It took me several tries to defeat the first crown, mainly because dealing with its minions initially felt tedious. But once I gathered better gear and learned to pressure the boss to avoid its long-range lunge attack, things got much easier. The second crown, however, was a bit more frustrating. Its AoE jump attack has insane tracking, and I was forced to rely on the parry mechanic to survive. Despite having an easier time parrying the bosses as mentioned before, the parry still feels like it needs some reworking. Currently there are 3 crowns to fight, but the third crown hasn't been revealed yet. Instead, the second crown serves as a placeholder, so you fight him twice. The ultimate endgame boss, the Abyss King, isn't in the game yet, which is understandable since Hyperlight Breaker is still in early access. Here's hoping Heart Machine adds more variety and polish to the boss fights as the game develops. The overarching difficulty curve is high up front, but comparatively drops off a metric crap ton by the time you reach the endgame. Obviously, you shouldn't be able to melt enemies and bosses left and right. However, fighting early on was a little stressful. You're forced to bob and weave constantly, playing it extremely safe, which I think could be at least partially remedied by making the parry feel better than it currently does. Despite these issues, the combat is mainly skill-based and fun. Once you master dash-canceling combos and build synergies with holobites, the only time you'll struggle is when you make a mistake. It's just a shame that the difficulty curve is so steep at first, only to drop off a cliff once you got decent gear. Hopefully that'll be addressed in future patches. Either way, launching an exploding spear into a group of enemies and watching them disintegrate into a mist of purple particles, chef's kiss. Speaking of visuals, I've seen some critiques of the game's appearance and honestly, I'm a little confused. To me, it looks dope. Hyperlight Breaker takes the neon-drenched post-apocalyptic aesthetic of Hyperlight Drifter. Each biome from the lush forests to the icy tundras feel distinct and alive, with bright neon purples and pastel color schemes that make the world pop. My only minor gripe is that, although counterintuitive, the procedural generation can sometimes make the world feel a bit samey after a while. But when you're gliding through a desert canyon or exploring a crumbling ruin, it's hard not to be impressed. Hopefully they will improve this mechanic as game development progresses. And if Hyperlight Drifter is anything to go off of, then I have complete faith that they will. The sound design and music in Hyperlight Breaker are just as impressive as the visuals. Akash the Car, who worked on Hyperlight Drifter, returns to create crunchy, satisfying sound effects that perfectly match the game's aesthetic. The music is shrouded in a cozy combination of ambient, electronic, and impressionist vibes that complement the core of the genre and the game's primary themes. One of the composers, Joel Corlitz, describes it as rich, textural pieces that support the world, and he's not wrong. Tracks like the one in the main menu or the one that plays when you enter the hub are so good they make me want to blast them on repeat while cruising through a neon-lit city at 2 AM. My only complaint is that some enemies, like the wolves, are eerily silent. I've lost count of how many times I've been bitten in the ass because I didn't hear them coming. A bit more audio feedback for enemy movements would go a long way in making the world feel more alive and fair. Right now, the story in Hyperlight Breaker is pretty bare bones. As mentioned earlier, you're a breaker tasked with defeating the crowns and overthrowing the Abyss King in a post-apocalyptic world filled with ancient technology and crumbling ruins. It's a cool premise, but it feels more like a setup for future updates than a fully fleshed out narrative. That said, the world building has potential. The overgrowth is a mysterious, ever-changing land, and the crowns have sick designs despite only 2 so far. Ideally, they'll have more distinct bosses soon. I just wish there was more to sink my teeth into, like, what's the deal with the Abyss King? Why are the crowns so important? Hopefully, Heart Machine will expand on these ideas as the game develops. So, should you play Hyperlight Breaker? The answer is a yes, with some caveats. Yes, there are rough bits and frustrating moments, but overall, I genuinely enjoy it. The aesthetics, art style, and environments are stunning with vibrant colors and distinct biomes that make exploration a blast. That said, I can see them getting old quickly, and I hope future updates add more variety in layout and design. Combat has a great foundation, but it could be better. The dash, while not bad, feels like it's missing something, maybe a flash step mechanic or an additional utility. The parry is clunky and enemy variety is currently lacking, but when the combat clicks, it's incredibly satisfying. One mechanic I forgot to mention earlier is how you receive more ammo for your ranged weapon. In Hyperlight Drifter, every time you attacked an enemy, you started building up your ammo, but in Hyperlight Breaker, only certain weapons and or drops can replenish your ammo. On top of the fact that flying enemies in this game are more of a nuisance to fight than I would like, it kinda disrupts the gameplay flow when you have to deal with them. On a last note for combat, it does contain an overly punishing early game and a story that's still in its infancy. The ambience, sound design, and music are fantastic, though I'll admit Hyperlight Drifter's soundtrack stood out a bit more. Still, the sound and music team have created an audio experience that perfectly complements the game's aesthetic and themes. Some people argue that Hyperlight Breaker uses the Hyperlight name in vain, but I disagree. The developers are clearly receptive to feedback, and I'm hopeful they'll take the game in a better direction. I'm thinking it's a little too early to say that it's an irredeemable game. The negativity surrounding it feels a bit overblown. I recognize that I didn't cover every single flaw that this game has, but just the ones that I noticed the most. And look, I get it. You could argue that there's too many bugs or the game's unoptimized, or some people's experience early on is just way too punishing, and yes, that's valid, but I feel like it's way too early to write this game off and assume that it's doomed when there's still so much more time to go, and I have faith that Heart Machine will turn it around. And if they don't, then they don't. I'll take that L because I'm a rational human being. But anyway, that's enough yapping. If you're a fan of roguelites or the Hyperlight series, Hyperlight Breaker is definitely worth your time, especially if you're willing to overlook its early access growing pains. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and hitting the like. It really helps the channel grow, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on Hyperlight Breaker in the comments. Anyway, that's it, y'all. Peace out, and I'll see you in the next video.